Welcome to Forbidden Planet TV. I'm Andrew Sumner, and this is a special episode dedicated to the concept of the first comic I loved. So I spoke to a bunch of friends of Forbidden Planet TV, people who work here behind the scenes, the owners of the company, myself, and the theme of this episode is the first comic book you either bought or fell in love with. Lots of varied answers to this question from lots of creators that we love and colleagues that we love. And here's my answer. The very first comic that I was bought by my grandfather, Pop Smythe, was Batman 184, which is around the time of the Batman TV series. And it's the hotline from the Batcave, and it's Batman and Robin's faces covered in cobwebs with the mysterious lettering wordage on the cover. For 13 jittery nights, the bat signal blazed in the sky. For 13 desperate days, the hotline remained unanswered. Where are Batman and Robin? Not even they know. And because I've talked about that a bunch of times over the years, that was the first comic I was ever bought, and that ignited my interest in Batman. And very shortly after that, I went to see the Adam West Batman movie in late 66, early 67 with my dad at the Heaton Moor Cinema just outside of Stockport. Pops then bought me another issue, which was Batman 190. And this is an issue that stuck in my mind my entire life. It's not particularly memorable, but like the issue I've just talked about, the cover is by Carmine Infantino, who then became the publisher of DC Comics. And it's a beautiful piece of work with the Penguin and his specialty umbrellas attacking Batman and Robin, taken from a kind of forced perspective as the Penguin flies out of the sky on top of Batman and Robin. And if my pal Josh has done his job, which I know he will have done, you'll have seen both of those covers while I've been talking about this. And I had that issue for years. I don't now. But there's something about it I absolutely love. And every time I run into that image, I have to stop and admire it and look back on those early nascent days of my Batman fandom, which have played such a big role in the course of my life and the course of these conversations at Forbidden Planet TV. Anyway, that's my kind of comic that I loved. But here's a whole bunch more. Hope you enjoy.
I remember really liking Spider-Man. Spider-Man felt like it was everywhere. There was an animated show. It was on a kid show called The Electric Company. There were comics everywhere, so there were toys. So just again, it was just a thing that was in the atmosphere. And then through that, it led me to the other characters. But I remember Spider-Man kind of being my entry point. I can't remember a specific issue. I just remember it a thing in the air.
I loved comics when I was a kid, kind of 10 years old, 12 years old, but somewhere in my mid-teens, I sort of got a bit bored with them and moved on to the other sort of pursuits of young adolescent males. And I went off to train to be a building surveyor because it seemed the idea of making a living in comics wasn't really quite possible. And I remember being on this survey and going into a corner shop to buy some cigarettes, which I at that time I smoked. I don't smoke now, and I strongly suggest that our younger viewers don't spend any money smoking because it's a complete waste of time and health. Having said that, I was standing waiting to be served in this corner shop, and at eye level was a comic spinner rack, and right in front of me was a copy of Green Lantern drawn by Gil Kane. It was called Prince Peril's Power Play, and it oozed dynamism. It was so far beyond what I'd seen Gil Kane do when I was younger and watch him draw Green Lantern. And I just had to have the comic. And I actually took it off the rack, bought my cigarettes and said to the guy, oh, and I'll have this comic for my younger brother as well. I haven't got a younger brother. I was so craven that I wanted to read it as a comic myself. And I would really say that it was seeing that and being thrilled once again by what comics could do that again led me away from being a building surveyor and into what I'd always really wanted to do, which was be a comic book guy.
The first comic I ever read was Marvel Tales 63, which was a reprint of a John Romita Sr. Spider-Man issue, where Spider-Man fought Electro and lost. And the other, I bought two at the same time, Marvel Team Up 38, where Spider-Man and the Beast teamed up against the Griffin. So I always felt that Spider-Man was a guy who could lose at any moment or wasn't good enough to beat a villain by himself. So he was always on the back heel, which to me that was so much cooler than Batman or Superman. Like, this guy had to work for it, and there was a chance every time you opened up a comic and read it that he could lose. I was on the edge of my seat with every single issue of any comic book with Spider-Man in it. And the reason I bought them was that Spider-Man came to my hometown and he was going to sign comics. So I knew what comic books were, but I'd never bought any, but I wanted to meet Spider-Man. So my dad started me on allowance, a quarter a week, and he gave me an advance so I could have 2 quarters so I could have 2 comics for Spider-Man to sign. And those were the 2 I picked.
There was a news distributor in Singapore next to my father's office, where when I was young, I used to haunt the place because I would go down after school and sit there and wait for him, and I got really bored, so I went hunting. They had at least 3 spinners of comics and piles of mass market books, because in those days, comics, books, mass market books were all distributed by one person, one type of distributor. And so it became my home away from home, and the place I would go to in my personal library. So, and of course, my dad knew exactly where to find me. There was I was initially attracted to the surreal, sort of vivid Steve Ditko images in Doctor Strange. And the story just pulled me in because there were elements of Eastern mysticism and lots of great words like the Eye of Agamotto and the Wand of Watum. And then on top of that, he went on great adventures, with fighting Cthulhu-like monsters and going into the dark dimensions, fighting Dormammu, and using great, really nice spells. So that was my favorite comic of that time when I first started reading comics.
Well, one of the first that I remember buying was at a local comic shop, and I went and I was attracted to the cover. It was a Brian Boland cover. It was Scarecrow. I don't remember exactly what issue it was, but it was a comic called Batman Gotham Knights. And it was just this really great drawing of the Scarecrow and Batman. I believe he was splayed out, so the shot or something. And it was just this great drawing, and I was attracted to it, and I bought, with whatever allowance I had, I started buying all of the covers for that series because I loved the Brian Boland art so much. So that's one of the first comics that I really remember buying.
Well, as the son of a comic artist, it was always there. So I was just like going through comp boxes of like DC, everything that DC put out. So I haven't got like a specific thing, like a standout moment. It was just always there, and I was just digging through boxes after box after box, pulling out like all the Batman books pretty much, I think.
Yeah.
So not a specific answer, but yeah, anything from sort of like late 90s DC.
Well, it's actually Captain Marvel as a comic book, as opposed to a comic, weekly comic. I was at a school. I remember this very clearly when I saw a copy of the Rainbow Annual with Tiger Tim in it, and I remember sort of expressing excitement. We were at the school tuck shop. This was a boarding school, and I remember saying, "Oh, look, Rainbow! The new Rainbow Annual's out!" And I got really badly told off because it was a comic, and they disapproved of comics, even poor old Tiger Tim. So I had, the comic book was Captain Marvel. Probably the weekly comics were things like Tiny Tots and whatever other weekly Fleetway comics were around. Probably the Rainbow. and Mickey Mouse Weekly as well, which was a brilliant comic. It was the first photogravure comic, and so the color was just beautiful on it. And I didn't much like most of the comic itself, but the colors on the front and back were so brilliant that I just fell in love with that, you know. And I've still got some of them because you could get tones, you know. You got like a watercolor tone going through it, which letterpress comics couldn't do. So yeah, but really, Captain Marvel. I got beaten up because of Captain Marvel. All the other kids were Superman fans, and it was easy to find Superman comics in those days. They were reprints, but you couldn't find a Captain Marvel comic. Not in those days. Not a proper one until Mick Anglo started reprinting them. Thornton Porter started reprinting them in black and white. And sometimes in Woolworths, they were in brown and white. It was a very strange sepia sort of colored version of Captain Marvel, and Whiz Comics, and you know the various other versions of Captain Marvel Jr. and so on, which we've talked about before. And as I think I've told you, I've got a CC Beck original, so I'm very proud of that. Yeah,
I was this transatlantic kid. Living between America and England. And I have to say, after reading my first comics, I almost gave up comics entirely. So my first comic was in the late 50s, which would have been a Superman family comic. And then when I came back to the UK, it was Beano or Landy, which were comics that were forced on you by your grandparents and really were not very funny, but were supposedly humor comics. Anyway, so my day of redemption came when I found Batman and started reading Batman comics, and I thought, wow, this is really quite different. But that wasn't actually where the collecting began. The collecting began with two comics, with Fantastic Four #4 and Spider-Man #2. Fantastic Four, of course, got a slight story to it, I think more interesting, which is that I was really sick. My mother decided to buy me some comics because she knew I was starting to get into them. So she brings me both the comics and I'm reading them, and my Fantastic Four disappears. Now, that's the one with Submariner, and that was when Human Torch decides to jump away from the Fantastic Four, and he goes and he finds this Golden Age character, the Submariner. Anyway, so my mother, I realized, was actually stealing my Fantastic Four comic. And it kept disappearing. And I realized that actually she had become infatuated with Prince Namor. And she saw this really cute guy she thought was cute. I guess maybe she thought she was Sue Storm or something. She found this really cute guy, and he was wearing this pair of swimming trunks, and of course it didn't strike her that it was necessarily the King of Atlantis or the Prince of Atlantis. It was just a guy wearing some pretty tight swimming costume briefs, and she just disappeared every so often with the comic. Of course that made me think, hey, pretty cool. And that was how my Marvel comic collection began, with Fantastic Four #4.
The first comic I remember buying and enjoying would have been a very early 2000 AD. It's pretty sure it's Prog 11. Got a Boland cover. Dan Dare's Mr. Monday guy beckoning us into the heart of the sun. It's got Bill Savage fighting wild dogs, Dan Dare fighting the Battle of Jupiter, Dread's fighting the Robot Wars, Harlem Heroes are hitting people with 100-mile-an-hour steel balls. Who else did you? Flesh, of course. Actually, that was the moment when the Great Predator clans gather outside the Trans Time base with Old One Eye, the Tyrannosaur Queen, at their head. I mean, my brain was melting. There's a particularly good episode of Mach 1 in that, actually, where John Probe gets some diplomat or other across Eastern Europe in a souped up Lagonda. He drives down mountains, through rivers, over tanks. He runs people over. He drives through trains while they're moving. By the end of it, as I recall, the Lagonda's wrecked. Probe's absolutely fine, and this diplomat has had a massive nervous breakdown, and whatever he was supposed to be delivered for, he's no use for whatsoever. Really, to be 7 and reading stuff like that, bottled lightning, yeah, you couldn't make it up.
The first one that I recall really grabbing me was Marvel Superhero Secret Wars issue number 7. I bought it off the stand. I was just like, I was amazed. It was like every superhero and supervillain, and it seemed like the biggest thing in the world to me at the time. And yeah, it started a lifelong love affair with comics for sure.
So the first comic that ever really meant anything to me was an issue of Amazing Spider-Man from sort of the early to mid 2000s by John Byrne. It was an issue in which Carnage had sort of disappeared, and Cletus Cassidy was desperately trying to get him back, just sort of rampaging through the city. And I remember the cover had sort of the symbiote like leaking down, and it looked very bloody. And I remember my mum was a bit worried that my nan and granddad would be a bit upset that I'd taken that round to visit them. And I had to convince them that actually, no, it was a like gooey alien thing, it wasn't blood at all. And then I read the comic, and it turned out it was blood, but they didn't need to know that.
Yeah, the first one I bought myself was Amazing Spider-Man 345. I'm 90% sure it was 345. I can never remember the number, but it's the first appearance of Cardiac, and I used to think it was 344, but that ain't it. Or maybe it is 344, and I'm misremembering. Anyway, blue cover, Rhino fighting Spider-Man, Cardiac, and it's got a ton of text. It's got dialogue with the Rhino talking to Spider-Man, and it's got like a thing running across the top that's like, what's going on with Venom or something. And it's just such a dense. It's from 1991, but and it's drawn by Eric Larson. It's a David Michelinie comic, it's not how 90s covers usually look. Like it's much more harkened back to how the 60s comics looked, but I just loved that cover, and I must have read that comic 100 times. It's the first appearance of Cletus Cassidy. I recently started collecting that comic, so now anytime I'm at a comic shop, I'll buy that comic, which is even more embarrassing that I somehow can't remember the exact number. I think I have like 300 copies of that comic. I'm trying to get like a long box because I think it'd be hilarious to have a long box of one comic. But it's also fun when you collect a single issue, because then you can go, okay, this one, this was later in the run, so the printing's super dark. This one was trimmed in a weird way. This one's got this over to the side more. This, like there's so many different it's got a flat like turquoise blue background, and it's vastly different from copy to copy how that cover looks. And I've never noticed that because I've never had multiple copies. I've never had that many copies of one single comic. So it's pretty fun. I understand I seem like a lunatic now. I don't care.
Okay. One of the first and most impressive comics I ever saw was an issue of Captain Britain, which was I think it was in part of the Daredevil series, where Captain Britain and was it the Vixen? No, not the Vixen. One of the bad guys were thrashing each other through Forbidden Planet London. And I remember seeing it and thinking that looks like a real place. But I was in Belfast, of course, so I didn't know it was a real place. But I thought that looks real. And those people in that panel, they don't look like they've just been. They look like real people. This is real. So that's one of my first early memories of comics. I mean, it's not my earliest, obviously, but it's certainly my first Forbidden Planet comic book memory.
Let's see. Okay, one of the first comics that I can remember. I mean, there are loads of 2000 AD issues, like the ABC Warriors. That story where they're in Victorian, the planet with Victorian England. But the one comic that I can remember, and I just picked up this All-Star Squadron. I picked this up about 2 weeks ago, and there is, I think it was the Yes. That issue. This was the only issue of this series that I had. I hadn't a clue who most of the characters were. I had no idea what happened afterwards. The lovely thing about Omnibus and collections is that you can finally read what happened in these obscure random issues that you picked up part 1 or 3 or 5 of, and you've no idea as a kid what happened. And now finally I can read what happened. So yeah, that would be one of the first comics I ever bought.
Gil Kane's Green Lantern, especially the ones with all the other lanterns from outer space, all the alien lanterns. I love those. They really made a big impression on me.
Okay, I don't know what it was. It was an issue of Iron Man, and it was very Cold War, and the bald guy kills himself at the end rather than fall into the hands of the communists.
The first comic that I got really into was Batman Contagion that came out in the mid-90s. It was all had skulls in it. I wasn't really into reading at the time. I was really like in school, I couldn't be bothered to read, and I saw this Batman cover, had skulls on it, and there was a contagion that was hitting Gotham. And I went every month to my local newsagent and picked it up, and it really got me into reading. And then I fell in love with Batman, and the rest is history.
So I got into comics quite late. I wasn't really interested. I didn't think it was my kind of thing. I was more into like reading books. I grew up reading books, novels, everything. I didn't think it was my kind of thing. And then Gerard Way released The Umbrella Academy, and I knew that I had to read it. And then I found out that actually comics, graphic novels, everything, it's all for me. I enjoy it as well. But that was my starting point. And I like the fact that you can just start at that. You know, it can be, you don't realize you like it, then you start there and you go from there and carry on.
So for me, it would be the Frank Miller Daredevil where he fights Gladiator. I remember as a kid being given that. I was in the back of a taxi. Taxi driver said, "There's a comic here. You kid want to read it?" And it was like an artifact from another world. First time I'd ever read a Marvel comic. Absolutely blew my mind.
I forget the number of the comic, but I think I'm aging myself here, but I think I was like 10 or 11. And my best friend, her brother he collected comic books. And so his mom, from her job, she got like a file cabinet. So he filed all of his comic books and kept them in plastic. And he never let anyone touch them except me. So I remember the very first comic book I read was an X-Men comic. I don't remember the number, but this was when Professor X, when his body was invaded by the Brood. And so that's when they took the alien out, and I think that was the introduction when Professor X had that cybernetic body that Lilandra had given him. So I remember that. And the very first comic book that I actually bought was years later, was the Infinity Gauntlet comic. That was the very first one that I bought.
So what I remember is I would get comic books when I was sick. My dad would go to the convenience store and come back with like a bundle of comics, and some of them were like silly ones, like I feel like they were like a lot of Casper the Friendly Ghost and things like that. But then there would always be like I remember like a Green Lantern and a Superman comic thrown in there. But I wasn't a regular comics reader. This is like, kindergarten age. So I would just sort of be popping into the stories, but I can't remember the specific titles, and the comics always got destroyed. We never, my brothers and I would share them, and so they were never preserved. But I was also a child of television, so I got into comics through that, and there were a lot of Marvel Transformers comics, if you'll remember those.
Yeah.
And so the Marvel, G.I. Joe, and Transformers comics I was really into. And then they did like a G.I. Joe Transformers crossover, and the cover was Bumblebee being destroyed, his head coming off and his arms, just like the toy does when you play too rough with it. And I couldn't believe this was the first that I'd ever seen like a major character in a comic or a cartoon being annihilated like that. So that one sticks out. But then the in terms of superheroes, I think the Secret Wars issue that had, if you remember, Doctor Doom kind of like being burned alive and he's all tattered and decaying. That one really that sticks out in my mind and my brother's mind as one of our very earliest comic?
So the first comic I remember reading, I didn't really grow up with them, but when I was little, I loved the Muppet Babies, and somehow my grandma came across a comic that had Muppet Babies, and I was so little I thought it was a coloring book, and that's what I did to it. I wish that was still existed somewhere, but then many years later, the first one I remember buying was V for Vendetta. That's the movie, seeing that, is what kind of like opened my eyes more to the comics world. So I went out and bought the graphic novel, and then it's been a wonderful downhill slide since then.
Well, my mom was the person who got me reading Dick Tracy, and Harvey Comics published the Dick Tracy comic book, which was old, recycled comic strips. And issue number 76, I have the cover on my wall, and I started reading it around issue 73. And 73, 74, 75, 76, that's the true golden age of comics.
If you're enjoying watching Forbidden Planet TV and you're enjoying watching us talk to the world's most interesting and accomplished filmmakers, authors, artists, musicians, creators, subscribe right here. See you soon.